Now I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Dale Rose. Dr. Rose is a nationally recognized expert on talent assessment, coaching, and 360-degree feedback in particular. Dr. Rose personally coaches over 150 leaders per year, including focused post-360 feedback sessions and also more long-term engagements. While he most frequently works at the executive and C-suite level, he's supported leaders at every level, from board chair to first-line supervisor. In addition to his coaching work, Dr. Rose is a widely published author in academic journals, and his book, Hire Better Teachers Now, was recently released by Harvard Education Press. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Rose.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you all for joining me today. I'm excited to be talking about one of my favorite topics, 360-degree feedback. It's a fantastic tool and an interesting process, and I'm going to be talking today about best practices in 360 feedback. I'm going to be presenting some data. I'm going to be presenting some ideas, some thoughts, some personal opinions. So we're going to get into a kind of a wide range of things and thinking about how 360s can best be used in organizations. It's a fascinating topic, particularly because of the wide range of what you can do with a 360 tool. So let's just jump right into it. Just briefly wanted to hit a little bit about 3D Group to give you some context, kind of what our experience is and how we come to doing this work. We've been doing this work for over 20 years now, and all the work we do is grounded. As you can see here, we really have kind of three practice areas that we emphasize. 360 feedback is probably our biggest focus. We also do employee surveys, and then both of these load into a development orientation for leaders, as Jesse mentioned, kind of at all levels. There are many of us around the country that do this work, but all of it is grounded in core research on best practices in evaluating talent and then helping those evaluations translate into results. And so while we certainly have our own point of view about what works best, that point of view is very well grounded in a body of research, and I think that's really critical when you think about best practices, is that it's not just about practice and what we've done, but really what's been found to work generally across industries, et cetera. We do have a wide range of clients we work with, just kind of a sampling of them. You can see the range. One of the great things about the range of clients we work with here is that we really don't apply a single methodology to each one. We really come in and look for what are they trying to do, and given those goals, how can we tailor a process to them? And I think as you'll see as we go through our presentation today, that approach is quite critical for 360s, because knowing what it is you're doing, what your goals are at the outset, can radically change the purpose for what you're doing. So let's take a look at the agenda for today. I've kind of divided things into two sections. So the beginning is really going to be a little bit more basic around what is 360 feedback, what do we mean, what are the kind of core elements. And you'll see in that some pieces that are critical for understanding how to design a program. And then later we'll get into part two, which is getting started. So how do you design? Given that, how do you design it? And at that point, we'll go through a few key decisions that anyone would need to do in looking at a 360 process. And we're going to bring in some data, some benchmark data, particularly around how companies typically do that. And then I'm going to contrast kind of some of those choices with what we've seen work and not work quite so well. So when we think about feedback in the workplace, one of the things that's interesting is that you tend to get feedback in a typical environment really from kind of one source. So your typical workplace feedback is going to come from your boss. Your boss is the kind of individual most in control of your career and your success at work. And so one of the interesting things to think about is, when you typically, unless you're in a matrixed organization, you've got one boss. So which one of these would you like to be the one giving you feedback? The point here is that having one individual giving you all the feedback, they've got a perspective. If you look at each of these individuals, they look like they've got a point of view. And if those individuals have a point of view about you, they may have some blind sides. They may not be giving you all the valuable, useful feedback that you need. Perhaps the person's just overly optimistic and doesn't give you critical feedback about what you can improve and what you can develop. Perhaps they're overly pessimistic and never show you when you're doing a great job. So there are some real limitations to having a single person providing all of the feedback that you get, which is, of course, what a kind of a typical workplace environment is. That's the opportunity that 360 feedback presents, is to sort of break that paradigm or at least add another element to it. So whereas this might be typical feedback, kind of pick one of these as your manager, 360 feedback takes a different approach, and it recognizes that as a worker, you work in an environment with lots of different constituents. You have peers, you have people that maybe report into you. Of course, your boss isn't an immaterial person in terms of constituents. And then you may have other groups, internal customers, business partners you depend on to get your work done, etc. And so 360 feedback provides an opportunity to look more holistically at what it is you're doing in the work, how effective you are, and to give you a more well-rounded view of your behavior in the workplace. And what's interesting is that we find that when you look at the feedback from these different sources, you get a much more complex, nuanced point of view than you might get just from that one leader. And so 360 feedback, when well constructed, gives you an opportunity to understand those different perspectives and then respond to them. So when we define 360 feedback, in fact, that's exactly what we look at, is to say, let's see if we can blend all of these views and understand what these perspectives are, and then use that for improvement. So if I were going to define 360 feedback, this is how I would look at it. I would see it as, first of all, and this is an important distinction, it's a survey-based method. So it's a survey-based method that allows some anonymity, that gets you that honest behavioral feedback from coworkers. So the interesting thing here is that even if you get multifaceted feedback from multiple people, you need a method that's going to allow them to comfortably give you honest feedback. If you go to your direct reports and say, hey, am I being clear in my instructions and direct? Well, oh yeah, no, you're great, everything's fine. Okay, maybe, maybe not. But if given a way to anonymously and honestly give you feedback about what you could do better, it's like, well, your instructions are, but they're not in the right time. I get them too late or too early or not detailed enough or whatever. So being able to get that honest feedback is what's going to be most valuable. And so a well-designed 360 process will not only give you a multifaceted perspective, but when the survey system is set up properly and the process is implemented well, it also gives you a way to get that honest feedback. Now, an important component is that honest feedback is not just sort of what I call sort of the horoscope, right? The horoscope's going to be interesting. Ooh, I get honest feedback from my employees. That's fantastic. That's interesting. My horoscope's interesting. But is it really helping me to be more effective? That's where the rubber really meets the road with 360 feedback, is it ought to be designed and delivered and implemented in a way that allows you as a person receiving feedback to look at yourself to be more effective. So as we go through looking at what 360 is and how you would design it, thinking about it in these terms, what elements of this process are going to encourage honest feedback? What elements of this process are going to keep it behavioral versus, say, trait-based? You know, is this person a good person, a bad person? That's not as interesting as very specific behaviors that they're doing. It's not as useful. So you want to get those kind of specific behaviors and then again put it in the frame of being more effective at work. All right, so the basic components that we see when we're looking at 360 are these three elements. So you're talking about a survey-based tool. You're talking about workplace behavior, and again, multiple sources. So you want these three components to show up in every process. Now, there are plenty of processes that will use interviews, okay, and people talk about interview-based 360, and there's some challenges to that. It's not that that's not a valuable tool for feedback, but is it really an effective way of getting a comprehensive view? One of the challenges one of the elements of an interview-based process that is missing is that you don't have a full set of coverage. So with a survey tool, you could have 50 or 60 behaviors that every single respondent replies to in a similar way, so you can get a very clear, tight comparison between those groups on a specific behavior. In an interview, the value of an interview-based process is you may follow a different path. Someone may mention something that you want to explore further, and you can go do that and go, so in depth that it may use up all your time and not give you an opportunity to cover all the different topics that you might otherwise have done. So it's a valuable qualitative approach, but it may be different than what you can get using a survey-based tool that can be a little bit more comprehensive. Some other great advantages to the survey-based tool is that when you use a survey-based tool across your organization, you can get alignment between your leaders. An interview-based process is much more difficult to do in that regard. And then, of course, the survey-based tool can also be a lot more efficient and cost-effective than the interview-based tool. Workplace behavior. Really critical to be thinking in terms, as I mentioned before, behavior, not traits. You're not trying to evaluate whether somebody's good, bad, friendly, not friendly, extroverted, introverted. You really want to know, what are they doing on the job? Because the focus here is to help leaders and individuals look at their own behavior and change that behavior. And again, it's workplace behavior. It's not, are you friendly or not? It's, are you customer focused or not? Those two may co-vary to some degree, but focusing people on workplace behavior, that's something they can change. It's not labeling people. And then lastly, the multiple feedback sources. Again, as we talked about, the idea that you've got multiple perspectives that you're bringing in, and designing your system in such a way that those multiple perspectives can really be compared is critical. You want to be able to ask each of those different groups, your direct reports, your peers, others, your boss, etc., the same question and be able to compare each of them on that to see what their different points of view are. So what does a typical process look like? A typical 360 process follows kind of three broad steps. Survey, sort of collecting the data, if you will, reporting on it. Interpretation, what does it mean? What do I do with it? There's some coaching support that should go there. And then follow-up, which is where behavior change really happens. So these three basic processes. One thing to be cautious of when you're doing a 360 process is don't get too caught up in the first piece. People spend a lot of time and energy on the survey process because that tends to be where you're having to make lots of kind of minute design decisions, but that's not really where the action is in terms of change. Really, the action in terms of change is kind of at the back end of interpretation and then moving into follow-up. So what the steps look like and the timing, people often ask, sort of, well, how long does it take? The first process, of course, does take the longest. You want to give people enough time to fill out the surveys. If you send out an invitation, you give them a day, you're not going to get a very good response rate. So usually about 3 weeks to get the survey data. You want to spend a little time up front orienting people. A lot of times when you roll out a 360 process, one of the key questions they ask is, well, what is this process? Why are we doing it? What is it for? If you can get the people who are all going to get feedback in a room, be it virtual or live, and answer some of those questions for them, it's going to take a lot of the concern out of the audience and help them really understand that this is about helping them to be more effective. And that can be a very valuable tool. Then, of course, identifying who the raters are going to be is also critical. If you, for example, were to select only half of your direct reports, maybe the ones you like, you're going to get very different feedback than if you select all your direct reports, which is certainly what we would recommend. And then, of course, completing the survey. I typically recommend about a week for these first two steps, and then 2 weeks for completing the survey, just to give people enough time to get in, accommodate vacation time, that kind of thing. And then about a week after you deliver the reports, you can deliver the report. You want to have a meet with someone that kind of makes sense of it. One of the things that happens when you get a 360 report, it can be a little bit emotional. There's lots of different information in there. We found having an individual, even for just an hour, debrief, what does this mean, where you go with it, can make a huge difference in change. And then really critical that they also discuss the results with their boss. They don't necessarily, you can decide this, they don't necessarily need to see the report, they don't need the details, etc. But at least, what is it that I learned from this, and what can I do, and how can my boss help me grow and develop in the areas that I've identified with my coach? And then there needs to be some follow-up. There has to be some real structure around, what am I going to do differently? What's my plan? What have I learned? It doesn't have to be 10 things you're going to change, but if it's 1 to 3 areas to focus on. And then one of the interesting findings the research is that actually going back to the raters and thanking them for the feedback, committing to them what it is you're going to develop, makes a huge difference in people actually changing their behavior. So this is kind of what a typical process might look like. There are lots of variations that you can bring in or not. You can decide not to orient raters. You can change the way you do it. Selecting raters at some point you need to do, but there are a lot of different ways to do that. Some organizations will not have a coach, or they will have a different approach to the way the coach is. It might be in a group setting. But fundamentally, something about moving through this process of completing the survey, interpreting, and then really coming up with some goals and following up are going to be critical to every process. So I often get the question when I'm asked, at a cocktail party, one of the most dangerous things you can do is to say that you're an industrial organizational psychologist. People just stare at you strangely. But they often ask, oh, well, I do 360 feedback. Well, what is that? What does it look like? So what does it look like? As I mentioned, it's going to be survey-based, and this is just one example. You can change lots of different components, but this is an example of a single question you might see in a 360 survey. One of my personal favorites, follows through on commitment. So when you see when the opportunity arises, when does this person, how often does this person do the following? Follow through on commitments. So you can sit here and rate. I'll call this guy Joe. When given the opportunity, is he always through? Almost never, frequently. You've got a range here from 1 to 5. Each rater is going to go ahead and answer that question, and then the results are going to come out averaged typically. So the self rating is, of course, going to be the 4 that the person picked. The boss rating, you can see here, is a 5 always. And then the peer is going to represent an average of all the peer scores, the direct report an average of all the direct report scores. And then the overall typically is going to be an average of the non-self scores. Okay, so in that case it's going to be, it would be these ones here, the direct report, the peer, and the boss. So that's typically what you're seeing. Just parenthetically, the down arrow in this case on our feedback reports, this shows that that score, that overall score, is in the lower 20th percentile compared to a national norm, which is kind of a nice feature to have. So this is typically what you're looking at. Now you might have, it's not just going to be one question, it might be 40 questions. It could be 50, 60 questions, all grouped by competency. But this is kind of the core of what the 360 is going to look like. Well, who uses it? Who should we give 362? Well, really we see 360s used at all levels within the organization. The interesting thing is that when you use it at each of these different levels, you can see kind of the color coding here. The process will vary a little bit. So typically at the executive level, that kind of vice president level, we're going to see a process that's going to be a little bit more, a colleague of mine called it kind of a concierge approach. A little bit more hand-holding, more likely to have follow-up coaching, just a little bit more intensive process. The content is also going to be a little bit different. So your content here might include strategy, contributing to critical discussions of strategy and direction. It might include significant amounts of influence, motivating, inspiring, those kinds of things. That's going to be a little different than, say, at the individual contributor level, where it's going to be probably more about your own individual efforts, teaming with others, etc. There won't be anything in an individual survey around setting culture, that kind of thing. And then the yellow group might be more of your typical kind of manager, kind of mid-level manager process, and that indeed may be a little different as well. The content may be a little different. Often at that level you will get some individual coaching to follow up, but it won't be, perhaps be an extended process, whereas vice president level and above, they might get sort of one debrief followed by a few follow-up coaching sessions. So kind of just a different process, and you want to think about these processes differently when you're designing it. But we really do see all levels of the organization able to effectively use 360 depending on what it is, of course, you're using it for. Now, one of the things people ask when they look at a 360 process, and I describe kind of what it is and what it looks like, is they say, well, gee, isn't that that could be kind of scary, getting feedback from all my colleagues, and why would you do that? Are you just asking for people's opinions? Is it like a popularity contest? No, 360 is based on kind of a fundamental concept about effectiveness. So one of the things we find about leaders in particular and individuals is that they're more effective when they're self-aware. And so fundamentally, what 360 is doing is helping people to be aware. And you see when you look at lots and lots of data here that a lot of people, when they get feedback, they find blind spots. They find places where they thought they really had to develop, and wow, actually everyone says I'm really effective at follow-through, and I was putting all this extra effort into it, but it's actually a strength of mine. Okay, so I'll leverage that, but maybe there's some other areas that I can focus my development efforts. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe I thought I was perfect on follow-through, but then it turns out that all my direct reports think I never get back to them. That's a great aha to have, and it can make a huge difference in terms of being more effective on the job. The trick is that awareness isn't necessarily enough, right? So knowing that I need to follow through more, knowing that there's an issue that I could be more effective in isn't necessarily enough. What I need more is not just the awareness, right? This person here, she certainly is aware that she has issues. She has some things might be problematic for her. But has she yet committed to change? Not necessarily. So you need to get the feedback may make you aware, but the process that you used designed around your feedback process, particularly around coaching and action planning, is going to help you get the critical component, which is acceptance. I'm aware that I need to be better at follow-through, but now I've accepted that I actually need to change that. And once you get to that point of acceptance that it needs to change, then you can start planning and moving forward. That's, again, a critical turning point in any 360 process, and you have to really work with leaders around getting to that point. That's really, frankly, what that coaching follow-up can do, is often get people past just the simple awareness and on to acceptance of a need to change, as well as give them an opportunity to structure that in a plan, etc. So when we get to kind of the overall view of how it works, you get this awareness, you get that critical element of acceptance, but then you need to make a plan. So I've accepted that I need to be better at follow-through on commitments with my reports. What's my plan for how to change that? There's lots of research on goal setting that shows that when you set a goal, you set a plan, you evaluate it, you're going to make change. But when you just intend to change, to do your best, you're not going to get nearly as much actual behavior change. So spending some time and energy on that action planning process. Again, probably supported with a coach, also integrated with some HR support is going to be really important. That then can lead you to behavior change. If you just stop at awareness, you just do what my friend and colleague Alan Church talks about as the desk drop, right? The desk drop. Here's your report, good luck. That may give you awareness. You may open that report up and say, oh, gee, this is I'm not really doing follow-through very well, but am I going to change? Not necessarily. So if the process can be designed around each of these three elements, not just the awareness, but helping people to come to a plan for change, then you're going to have a shot at getting to that change. So that gives you hopefully a little bit of an idea of kind of what the kind of underlying mechanisms are that need to be built into any given process. One of the interesting things about 360-degree feedback is it's not, we've come to see over the 20 or so years that we've been doing this, that 360 feedback is sort of not a program in and of itself. 360 feedback is actually a tool that's embedded within many different other kinds of programs. And it's a very critical tool, very unique tool, but seeing 360 as its own entity is perhaps overlooking a critical element. So if you look at why and how organizations do 360s, there are a huge number of uses. So the traditional, there's sort of a big debate, if you will, among 360 practitioners around should 360s be used for development or should it be used for decision making? We'll talk a little about how that may be a false dichotomy, but there are a set of uses here, whether it's training needs analysis, supporting an executive coaching process, literally improving teamwork, or just individual development planning that tend to be more sort of development oriented. you're going to do, you can do executive coaching, you can do development planning without a 360, but a 360 is going to be a very powerful tool to support all of those. It also can support some decision making. So if you're looking at a job transition, you're looking at, well, how can this person set into a new role? What can we do to support them? A 360 can be a great way early in a new job to help support that effort. Performance management, a lot about how 360s can and shouldn't be used to support performance management or to supplement or to replace a typical performance management process. Remedial coaching, succession planning is a very, very useful thing to use 360 data to kind of inform where you're moving people, et cetera. And then, of course, identifying your high potential. So a lot of different ways to use 360s and to look at them as kind of supplemental to these different approaches. Now, I really like, again, as I mentioned, there's kind of this debate is, should it be just for development only? Should it be for decision making? And there are some pretty strong opinions about that. I think my colleague Dave Bracken does a great job of articulating a way that might be a little bit more accurate to think about these two. So I wanted to just take a little tangent and illustrate his approach to thinking about this. So rather than looking at these as development or decision making, he talks about it as a continuum. I think this graph really helps illustrate what that continuum looks like. So you can literally try to use a 360 for performance assessment and have specific elements of a job in that survey tool and ask a team, how is this person doing on these elements of a job? Or you can have it be a self-driven leadership process where only the individual gets the report. They use it or they don't, entirely up to them. Wide range in the middle there, though, that could include development planning, succession planning, that's sort of, in the middle there. So certainly there's a development component, but also there's kind of a what role are we going to get this person into. So I think it's important for us as a field to start really thinking about this as a continuum and recognizing that it's not an either or. And the other thing that's come out in kind of these debates is a recognition that fundamentally development is going to be at the core of virtually all 360s. It's going to be at least a component of it. Again, if you're using it at the far extreme for downsizing literally, scores to drive who's going to remain in an organization, who isn't, which is not really a approach I would recommend. But if you're going to use it that way, of course, that's going to be a little bit of a different approach in terms of having virtually little or no developmental value. But almost any expert using a 360 process is going to be looking for what is the developmental component. Okay, so I promised everybody likes a train wreck, so I promised in the description some pitfalls. So I've given you a little bit of an idea of what it is, what the process looks like. What are some things to kind of avoid? So here are some common pitfalls, things that we see that when organizations step in these potholes, if you will, they get a little stuck. So the first thing is an unclear purpose, and this is what I was alluding to before when I said 360 as a program in and of itself may not be appropriate. You really want to think about, why are we doing this 360? What are we trying to use it for? What process are we embedding it in? Is it going to be used for succession planning? Is it going to be used just for individual development? Is it going to be used for identifying potentials? What is our purpose here? What are we trying to get out of it? I think many, many organizations would benefit from just stopping their design process and sitting on this one question for just a little bit and really gathering that information from multiple individuals. Because the other thing we see here is that the purpose from an HR perspective may be a little different than the purpose from a line leader perspective or a business line perspective. So really making sure that that purpose is clear to everybody and there's some shared understanding. To that point, the lack of support from the top. If 360 is an HR-only process, it's very limited, and it can certainly be successful in certain kinds of programs and processes, but the most effective use of 360 is going to be when it's driven from the top. It's used to sort of set the culture and set the tone of providing feedback, but also being directional in terms of what the leaders are expected to be doing to drive strategy. So if you can get that to be kind of driven from the top, it's going to have the greatest chance of success. People often underestimate the resources required to implement a 360. When I say resources here, I'm not just talking cost, but you're talking about a process of, we get an average of 12 to 15 responses per individual. So you could have, if you have 50 leaders in your organization, you could easily end up with 600 survey responses. That's a lot of coverage across your organization. Now, of course, software and all that can take care of some of the distribution, but you got to recognize you're touching a lot of different people with this process. So you want to make sure that you've resourced it appropriately in terms of getting the projects done. Another big pitfall, there's a lot of data in a 360 that's available. If you've got 70 questions in 5 groups, it's a huge number of data points to look at. And so there are just thousands of different computations that can end up in a report. One thing that people often recognize is that overly complicated report is being given to a leader, an individual, who's having a bit of an emotional moment here. I'm about to get feedback from 15 of my colleagues, and there may be some blind spots in there. So this overly complicated report that kind of hides the information for me and requires lots of time to figure out is a very, very difficult thing to process. It's going to be very hard to get that information and get to that kind of self-awareness that's the beginning. So you really want a report that's as simple as possible, giving you the clearest information so that the leader can quickly get onto that acceptance and move to the change aspect and not get stuck on awareness. So overly complicated reports can be a real problem. I mentioned before the importance of focusing on behavior. Focus on behavior that can be changed, that aligns with the organization's strategy. That is your best result from a 360 standpoint. When you start getting into personality, it gets just much more involved and bogged down. It's much more difficult to make that be an effective change process. The last you see where people struggle, and it's not that this is impossible to do, but when you're trying to use, it's certainly a cost-effective approach to be able to use HR employees as coaches to do the support. The challenge with doing that is you really need to make sure your HR staff has the competencies around the kind of the interpersonal aspect and the understanding the data and the reports, kind of an important combination. And coaching really is a skill, and so making sure that those folks have the skills to deliver it is very, very important. Even still, if the HR team has the skill set, there may be some individuals where they're not really wanting to be, they need to be that neutral party that's kind of right between the organization's needs and the individual's needs. And as a coach, you really need to be focusing primarily on that individual in that time. And so there are some cases where coaching for HR gets them in a little bit of a conflict of interest. Can be tricky. So not that it's impossible, but you've got to be very careful about how you do use HR staff as coaches and make sure they're well trained and have those right competencies. Okay, so that's a whole lot around kind of what success is, what to avoid, a little bit of thinking around some of the basics. The bottom line, and we get asked this question all the time, it's certainly out in the literature a bunch of, is this question of, do 360s work? Do they create change, or do they work, if you will? Our best answer to that is that they can work if you design them well, and the key is that little design tweaks can undermine a process really well, to a great degree. So you have to be very careful about how you design them in order to get the results that you're looking for. We did a study a number of years ago that's highlighted here, where we had 65 managers in the retail environment, retail managers, that went out and took their 360. And so one of the basic questions is, well, gee, if these 360s relate to something value added and we can get people to change on those, then we know it can be effective. And I thought this is a pretty telling result, in that we literally took the 65 and just split them down the middle, high score, low score, and found this very strong correlation where those higher scoring retail managers were generating significantly greater revenue with all kinds of controls for region and time, time in place and previous results and all those kinds of things. And so what we're finding is that these data, these behaviors, when the process is done right, these behaviors relate to critical organizational outcomes. So you can get those results. The question is, have you designed it properly? So again, when done well, 360 can help leaders to improve, which will then drive to those organizational results. And so I think the key question is, how do you design that process to get the result that you want in order to get the success